Buddy, and welcome back to Creation Myths. Looks like we are live, so I'm just going to make sure I can see myself over on YouTube. I can. So hi, everybody. Welcome. Just in the chat before we get started, just let me know that you can hear and see me okay, and you should also see Dr. Jeanson and then me again on screen. It looks like that's the case on my end, but I always like to just have some sound checks before we go. Great. Looks like we're ready. So let's do this. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Creation Myths. Tonight is a fun one. So let me tell you what is going on tonight. So it is, what is it? It's June 8th as I sit here. Back last week on June 2nd, 2022, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson of Answers in Genesis appeared on a show on the Striving for Eternity channel, which you can see right there on screen. And this was a show called Apologetics Live. This is a call-in show. So he did an interview and then people could join the stream and chat. So I hopped in and we ended up chatting for about an hour. And in that hour, I was destroyed, dismantled, demolished, forced into early retirement, what have you. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to watch some of the highlights together, some of the key moments, and see exactly how this dismemberment of an evolutionist live on YouTube went last week. Now, the context for this is I want to ask Dr. Jeanson about his recent book, Traced, and specifically about Neanderthal. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show some moments where I ask a question, and then we're going to see what Dr. Jeanson's responses are to the questions that I ask, and we will see exactly how he destroys my arguments. So this is my first time using the built-in play video on StreamYard thing for everybody watching. So if you don't see sound if you don't see sound, this guy, if you don't hear anything when I start playing the video, let me know in the chat and I'll find another way to do this. But in testing this previously, it did work. So let me know. Here we go. Here's where we're going to start. This is me. And by the way, I'll say I'm going to play clips. Some of them are going to be short. Some of them are going to be 2 to 3 minutes long. It's just sometimes I want to make sure we're getting the context for what we're talking about here. So this first clip, it's going to be about 2 minutes long. I'm going to play. It's me kind of the question that frames this whole conversation. So I'm going to start this and then we'll go from there. DNA is so relevant to this is because they are highly divergent from all the Homo sapiens sequences that we have. Homo sapiens form a nice, neat clade. We're all really similar to each other. And then Neanderthals form a separate clade over here. They're all more similar to each other than any of them are to us. And they're way more divergent. They're divergent from us. So if they are descended from, Noah's family, right, in the immediate post-flood era, then we need to account for that level of divergence. And even this 3 mutation per generation rate is not sufficient to account for all of that divergence from the rest of Homo sapiens. So I think we can be super confident that these sequences are valid for a number of reasons. One is that they form a nice, neat clade by themselves that's separate from the Homo sapiens clade. We shouldn't expect that. If they were degraded, they shouldn't be correlated with each other very well. They're inbred. We know that Neanderthals are highly inbred. We know that because they have lots of homozygosity. If they're degraded, then the 2 sets of chromosomes in that diploid set, they should not be correlated with each other. We would see less homozygosity rather than more. And then the third thing is that we can actually detect specific types of degradation. The most frequent type of DNA spontaneous breakdown is cytosine deamination to uracil. And when we look at Neanderthal sequences, we can see that they're enriched in uracil. It's a quantifiable amount of uracil that shouldn't be there because it's DNA, not RNA. So we know that all those uracils should be cytosines. We know that cytosine is way less stable than all the other bases. So if we can quantify and correct for the errors in cytosine, the rest of the genome is perfectly reliable. We can be confident in that. So we have perfectly good reasons to conclude that these Neanderthal sequences are valid. But that then breaks the 6,000-year time frame for the convergence of these sequences, or 4,500-year time frame for the convergence of these sequences, because they're so highly divergent. So I would love to hear your response to that. Okay, so that frames where we're going here. Now, I'm going to pick up here. I'm going to jump a little bit ahead because he doesn't answer the question right here. So what I'm going to do, there's some hemming and hawing. He pulls up his screen and everything. Some technical stuff with like screen sharing. So I'm going to jump ahead to right around here. And just very briefly, because he brings up this figure, this bar graph, you'll see. So here we go with this.
So just because there's a nice color graph I have here. And Dan has made this point, and Joel Duff has made this point, and I think Herman Mays has alluded to it as well. So I think I can illustrate it this way. Essentially, the argument is we've got this graph.
So he's going to take a couple minutes, go through this graph. We're going to chat. We're going to reach an agreement on the point that I'm making. So we're not going to, it's like 3 or 4 minutes. We're not going to do that. We're going to jump ahead up to 10:06 here, because he then says, okay, we agree on what the argument is. So let me go down and use this other illustration. So he goes down to this figure, and some of you may go, oh, I recognize that figure. So I'm going to have a question about this. So I'm going to play this for about 3 minutes, and it's going to be my question and his response. Okay, because this is a very specific question that I've had and a criticism I've leveled at Dr. Jeanson's work for a long time, that he is not correctly interpreting the way you convert this unrooted tree into a rooted tree showing ancestor-descendant relationships. And so I'm going to make this point, and then he's going to respond, and we're going to see if he addresses my concern and what his response is.
These are the illustrations I have handy.
Can I actually just pause for a second to ask a question about this tree? So this is, I just want to make sure I'm, because this one isn't labeled like some of the other ones of yours that there's the bigger one that has like the green arrows, and correct me if I'm wrong, but those kind of central nodes there in the middle, those, because this is a mitochondrial tree, those represent Noah's sons' wives. Is that the implication?
Yeah.
Okay, so question about this tree. What, just in general, on a phylogenetic tree like this, what does a line connecting 2 nodes represent?
It
would
would represent
2 nodes connected
mutations,
by a line.
It technically would represent the DNA differences between 2 people. I think the point you're trying to get at is that there would be some sort of implied ancestral relationship between these 3 nodes, which is
if
what
you
I
root the tree. Yes.
Yeah, which I put in one of the footnotes, that the identity of these ladies is not clear from scripture. They could have been sisters. They could have been ancestral related back to Eve in some way. And so, and I also discussed some of the details of how many mutations occurred pre-flood, because you have, I think on the tree, it's about 3 or 4 on these specific lines.
It's a little tangential to what we're talking about with the Neanderthals, but you're converting the unrooted tree to a rooted tree incorrectly, which is kind of, it's tangential to what we're talking about, but it is relevant to the broader picture.
That is an objection, though. You would need to explain instead of having a free pot shot.
Just saying, it's how phylogenetics works. It's when you root it, you have to have, so those lines get converted into ancestor descendant relationships. So the fact that they're connected in kind of daisy chains like this, right? It's either going to get converted into a situation where you have a kind of grandparent, parent, grandchild, or if it's in between, it's going to be some kind of parent offspring or parent descendant relationship. It's not going to be 3 coexisting individuals.
Right.
It's again, it's a small point that's not related to the Neanderthal thing, but it is relevant.
No, I agree with it. And that's my point, is that there could have been some wonky things pre-flood that I discuss in the literature.
Okay. So, okay.
That they could still be contemporary in time because the mutation rates pre-flood, or the generation times pre-flood, where you have in Genesis 5, for example, on the male line, you have 10 generations listed, but because the men live so long, you've got Adam, you've got another guy, and you've got Noah, and you can have that sort of genealogical overlap where only 3 generations pass in some lines, where you can have 10 generations in others, and that can lead to these sorts of relationships that we see in the tree.
I don't think that's exactly relevant to what I'm asking, but that's okay. I do want to not get off topic with the Neanderthal question that's specifically about traced, but it doesn't exactly address the problem with rooting the unrooted tree.
I'm saying it does imply, like you're saying, ancestral descendant relationships, but there's biblical data that's relevant to it that so I'm aware of that implication. It's not a contradiction. It's in line with what we see about generational overlap in Genesis 5.
Okay, so make sense of that, audience. So the objection here is that he takes this unrooted tree and he converts it. You know, when you root it, there's no way to get those three individuals as, you know, coexisting, unrelated kind of people in there. And Jeanson's response is, direct quote, "There could have been some wonky things pre-flood." That's the explanation to how you can have that ancestor-descendant relationship and still have those three nodes represent three concurrent individuals that were the Noah's daughters-in-law, right? That's the answer. Basically, it could have been, you know, pre-flood, long generational overlap kind of stuff. No, that's not an answer. You can't invoke like supernatural things or biblical things if what you're trying to do is like build a model that shows independently that story is accurate, right? You can't invoke the weirdness in the story in support of itself, right? You can't do that. So he acknowledges, he said right in there that, you know, my interpretation that this would result in ancestor-descendant relationships is correct, but that's okay because that can be consistent with the Bible. In effect, the response to my critique here is that it can be consistent no matter what the interpretation is, which is fine, but that's unfalsifiable. So we don't have a viable hypothesis anymore, right? A hypothesis is only good if you can test it and falsify it. Any interpretation, because wonky things pre-flood are possible, so this is no longer a falsifiable hypothesis. That's his answer to the three node thing, something I've been wanting an answer to for years. So okay, so now we're going to go to we're going to go just a little bit because he changes trees now, right? We're going to go to a different version of this figure, which you see on screen right now, which includes these archaic sequences that he calls fossil sequences. These are like Neanderthal sequences in here. So again, keep in mind, this is Jeanson going through these figures, right? The question was, why aren't the Neanderthal sequences valid? Here are all the reasons they are. The question is, why aren't they? And he's going through these figures for reasons. So this is, now we'll get to the next thing here. Okay, so we're right there. So let's what are we going to? We're going for right here. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So how do you think I would explain these? So just to clarify for people, this is similar to this other tree over here. It's mitochondrial DNA based tree. It's only based on 53 men.
Oh, let me just make a couple of quick notes here. This segment's going to go for about 4 minutes because he's going to say stuff, I'm going to say stuff, and we're going to talk a little bit, and it's important. The other thing I want to note is that linked below is this full conversation, in addition to a bunch of the videos I've done that are relevant to Jeanson's work. So like I've talked about the 3-node thing there with the mitochondrial branches. That's linked down below, in addition to a bunch of other stuff. So if you want the long version of kind of my point with the stuff we're talking about, you can find that stuff linked down below, in addition to this full conversation on the Striving for Eternity channel, which was like our part with me and Dr. Jeanson was about an hour. The whole show was like almost 4 hours. So that's linked down below. You can watch that if you want. And now back to it.
And the 3 nodes, you can hard to see way back here. And then these long branches are representing Denisovans, Neanderthals. So you can see visually at a glance that these really different sequences. So how do you think this diagram, what does this diagram imply about the origin and mutation rates in these sequences given my model?
So given my understanding of your position with Neanderthals is that the sequences are not actually reliable. So this long branch is more of an artifact than anything else. But if we take it at face value, which I think we should, that would imply that those branches have faster mutation rates because you have to squeeze more mutations into the same amount of time. But the slight problem with what I just said is that I'm using the phrase mutation rate when the more appropriate term would be substitution rate, because that's really what we're dealing with with mutation accumulation. It's not the per generation rate that matters. It's what mutations stick around in the population that matter.
You've advanced that argument before, and it's circular.
It's absolutely not circular.
It's the evolutionary model applied to the creation one. How do we know that
We-
it has to be the substitution rate? That's the question. And the
You
answer should
be-
be testable predictions. And the fact that my predictions are working is the counter argument.
So I've actually tested your predictions directly against some real world mitochondrial data. So for example, you can look at populations for which we know the exact divergence time. So things like island colonizations, things that are occurring within documented human history, things where we're not going outside the young Earth timeline. So it's things that we should all be able to agree on. And we can take your model, right, and say, okay, this many mutations per generation, this much time, and then say, okay, 20 years per generation, 30 years, you can get a range. And your model consistently overestimates how many mutations we expect to find differing between the groups in question. An example, this would be like the settlement of, I think it was the Canary Islands was one that I looked at specifically. And it wasn't like off by a little bit. It was off by like on the low end, a factor of 5, and on the high end, a factor of like 12 or 15 or something. So it is the mutation versus substitution rate thing is relevant because if you're using just the simple pedigree-based mutation rates, the assumption that you're building into your work by just doing the, rate times time thing is you're assuming that every mutation that occurs within a generation is ultimately fixed within that population. And that's selection occurs, drift occurs, stuff. People don't have kids. For Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA, people might have all boys or all girls, right? So it's not a reasonable assumption to think you can use such a strict molecular clock that you can take that one generation rate and extrapolate it back. And we have direct data testing that proposition, showing that it's valid. You actually cite 2 papers that do that in Traced. You say it's low quality data because the coverage is only 10 to 15 times, but those 2 papers, in addition to many others, show exactly the problem here.
I think you brought up about 3 different points that I think are worth discussing, but it'd be helpful for our audience if we take them one by one. The substitution rate is one, the dating of the mitochondrial, with historical archaeology, there may be a third one. So I think it'd be easier for our discussion if we take one at a time for the sake of the audience instead of rapid fire. So let's go back up to, let's return to those, since we're going afield now from the Neanderthal sequences.
We are. Yeah, I really love to hear about Neanderthals.
And so back to my question to you.
I missed it. Did I get an answer there? I must have missed it. I don't think I got an answer to any of that about how we actually have direct observations where we can test our hypotheses in terms of the mutation and substitution rate against real world events for which we have known dates in recorded human history. I didn't get an answer to that objection when he says, well, why is our model working? And the answer is it's not, because you make these predictions and you test it and it's not working. And the answer was, can we talk about something else? Okay, we don't have to talk about that now. That's fine. But there wasn't an answer there. I even still a week later, I don't really understand why we kind of went through these various figures in this. I don't really understand exactly what he's going for here, using these figures to like make his point rather than just like provide an answer. But anyway, we are going to now talk about Neanderthals a little bit. So that's nice. So let's jump ahead a little bit. We're going to talk about Neanderthals here. So we right here. That's where we want to go. Okay, so now we do get into a little bit of Neanderthals because we do get back to this figure and we say, okay, here we go.
These sequences are reliable. It looks like a hyper-fast mutation rate and would in fact then not be a contradiction to the tree. Joel Duff doesn't understand this point. He's completely reoriented the tree and doesn't seem to follow the basics of the model I've advanced.
Can I ask something about that hypermutation rate though?
Yeah.
Neanderthals are, if you take the sequences as valid, Neanderthals are highly inbred. So they can't be hypermutating if they're highly inbred. We would see more heterozygosity if they were hypermutating. What we actually see is an abundance of homozygosity.
Okay. It may not be a valid explanation. I just wanted to point out that there was, in some of the criticisms of Neanderthal sequences, there's an inherent circularity or a misunderstanding of the model. So
okay, so that was the answer to Neanderthals being inbred and therefore not hypermutating. And this is something that has come up before in my conversations with other people, that, oh, Neanderthals are so divergent because they're hypermutating. That's how they fit into the time frame. But that doesn't work because they're inbred. They have lots of homozygosity, which is the opposite of hypermutating. Jeanson said just right there at 1837 in the video, he said that there may not be a valid explanation. Yes. And then he goes and he doesn't explain it anymore. He takes a pot shot at Dr. Joel Duff for some reason, which it's not me. It's not addressing what I asked about. He's criticizing somebody else writing about this. I think Dr. Duff's critiques are valid, but that's irrelevant to the point that I raised here, right? In terms of this response to how do you explain the hypermutating? The answer is this other guy is wrong about what he said. Okay, but that's not an answer to the question. So I am going to skip ahead now because there's a part in the middle. It's the most important part. I'm going to save it for the end. So I'm going to skip ahead and we're going to get back to what I talked about earlier with the Canary Islands. So we're going to circle back around to that. So I'm going to jump all the way up here. Just skip about 10 or 12 minutes. Let's see. We're going to here. Here we go. Okay. So we are now circling back around to this question I asked before about the Canary Islands population, how well documented it is, and how we can directly test the two competing models. So we're going to go into more detail here, and we're going to see that Dr. Jeanson, instead of changing the subject this time and ignoring the question, he actually does provide an answer, what he thinks, what his response is to this problem. So this section, we're going to do this in little chunks. We're going to do about 3 minutes. Then we're going to skip a teeny little bit. We're going to do about 4 minutes. Then we're going to hop forward about 5 minutes, a couple of minutes, right? Because there's parts in here that are not relevant. There's parts in here of me trying to share my screen and it not working. So there's little things like that we're going to cut out. But I want to focus this on this specific Canary Island question and the broader question of, given direct historical records, things that happened in the recorded past, and the archaeological record that are well documented events in human history, we can match those very well. We can make predictions about the divergence between sister populations related to those events. We can then survey their genomes, and we can confirm that those predictions are accurate and that Dr. Jeanson's predictions are off by a lot when you use his model to make predictions and then test them. So that's kind of the frame up for this section. So let's just go through this. This will be a bunch of stuff. We'll go through it. Oh, I hear you, and I see, I get it with the branches and the number of branches and the historical record. That's not relevant to the mutation substitution rate question.
Just the way it's based on it. And so the question is, if all that I'm doing is wrong, why do I get this 95% match?
Let Dan finish that.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
The reason it's not relevant is because so the question we have, the disagreement we're having is, do you use a strict per generation molecular clock of the mutation rate to extrapolate backwards in time to predict what your mutation accumulation should be? Or do you use a substitution rate that takes into account the loss of diversity over generations, right? Where a mutation occurs and it doesn't persist indefinitely in that population. It will get lost over time in most cases, right? Obviously, some mutations are fixed in the population and mutations accumulate. So the way to test this is to take events where we have a well-documented, confirmed divergence date between two populations. We have population A, we have population B. We know when they diverge from each other, and we can measure the level of divergence in their genetics, right? And we can then say, okay, you have your rate. Your math is, just how many generations, what's the per generation rate? We can see if that matches up. We have the evolutionary model, which involves a curve because you lose whatever fraction of mutations over time, and the substitution rate in terms of the number of mutations that occur is much lower compared to the mutation rate, right? Mutation rate is mutations that occur. Substitution rate, this is for everybody. I know you know this. This is for everybody watching. Substitution rate is mutations that reach fixation in the population. So it's the rate at which differences accumulate between two divergent populations. That's what we're talking about here. So we can actually test this against like historical events that you and I don't disagree on the time frame, right? And the one that I've actually done like math on this, you can do this for a bunch of things. Do it for Iceland, which was 1,000 years ago. You could do it for, I think, Vanuatu, which was like 3-something thousand years ago. The one I've actually done the calculations on is for the Canary Islands, which were settled 22 to 2,400 years ago. And this is well documented. There's a very narrow window where the Canary Islands were first settled, and we know from where they were settled. So we know what the sister population is. So what we can do is sequence, I've done this for mitochondrial DNAs, because we have all the mitochondrial sequences here for their various groups. And we can just look at the mutations and do the calculations and make the predictions and see which model actually matches what we see. Okay, so at this point, I try to share my screen, and for whatever reason, it doesn't work, but I fixed it, and I know what to do in the future. That doesn't matter, so we're going to jump ahead a little bit to where I just, I'll just say the data. We'll just say the numbers instead of, trying to share it, and we'll pick up. So if we look at, and Dr. Jeanson, in your papers on the mitochondrial mutation rates, you have ranges for generation times, you have ranges for mutations per generation. So I'm using the numbers from those papers. I think specifically the 2015 one, the whole generation mitochondrial mutation rate matches D-loop rate. That one I think is where I'm getting these numbers from. And given the time frame between these two groups, 22 to 2,400 years, you could draw that out to 3,000 if you want to be generous to account for more potential mutations in there. The range of mutations that we would expect based on just a strict per generation molecular clock is between 23 and 120. That's the level of divergence you would expect between those two populations. Now, we've sequenced the mitochondrial DNA for those populations. They're each just one haplogroup, they're sister groups, so it's really nice and easy to do that. And the actual number of differences that we find in those two groups, depending on how you measure it, is between 2 and 4. It's a minimum of 2 and a maximum of 4. That's exactly in line with evolutionary predictions. It is between 5 and 60 times lower than the prediction you get using your strict per generation rate molecular clock. I should note we're going to hear from Dr. Jeanson in a second. This is going to carry on for about another 3 minutes. He's going to try to do this bank shot thing. You'll see, but I just wanted to let everyone know about 3 minutes of this, and then I'll jump back in. Which seems to me like a fairly good reason to reject that model as a way to calculate mitochondrial time to most recent common ancestry.
Yes, I wonder if you recognize the assumptions that are built into that analysis.
What would those assumptions be?
I'll see if I can draw it out Socratically. How many times have the Americas been settled?
How many times have the Americas been settled? I'm not up on the paleontology there, but I think it's 2, maybe more.
What is the dominant genetic lineage in the Y? I'll use Y chromosome because I know those data.
I haven't memorized. I'm sorry, I haven't memorized the Y chromosome lineages, but I would love to hear your response to the divergence between your predictions and the observations for the Canary Islands lineage.
The dominant lineage in the Americas is European and African in origin, not indigenous, in the Y chromosome.
Why is this relevant to the Canary Islands?
Because the assumption built into your analysis is that the lineage you're looking at is the original one, when we know from human history that human history is constantly changing. People are constantly replacing one another. Migrations are the rule. And so that's the inherent weakness of doing that sort of thing, is there's the built-in assumption that that lineage was the original lineage and not a late migrant in. And there really is no way to test that. It's an assumption that's made. And
it actually is, because in the Canary Islands, I apologize, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
But it actually is, because the Canary Islands are very unique in that you needed seafaring to get there. They're sufficiently far off of the coast of North Africa that you need to be reasonably good at sailing to get there. But the Canary Islands then became isolated. They stopped communicating with the mainland about 2,000 years ago. It was this a settlement event, and then they just stopped. And there's robust historical record for this, so that when European explorers stumbled upon the Canary Islands much later, we know exactly, now you're up into like the 1500s. So we have an extremely robust record of who was there, when they got there, and how much or little contact they had with anybody else.
And my point is, you can cite all that, and still you've got examples from around the globe of population replacements. Even today, the mitochondrial lineages in the Canary Islands are quite diverse. That's the built-in assumption of saying we're gonna say this sequence was the original. It wasn't a late migrant, and by assuming this was the original, now we can date it. Sure, if you make all those assumptions, that's where you land, but that's the inherent uncertainty built into that. Now, I want to bring up again the main counter arguments to it. My main counter. So my point is, there's some uncertainty. Maybe you're right, but if you're right,
okay. So that's his answer, is that, like you just said, there's some uncertainty, which, I mean, there isn't. He's not addressing the specific point I made about the historical records concerning the Canary Islands. It's really cool thing. There's a book I recently read called Boundless Sea, I think it's called Boundless Sea. And it's all about oceanic exploration and trade and movement and everything. And the history of the Canary Islands is fascinating, about how they were settled and then isolated. Dr. Jeanson is 100% ignoring all of this. He's just saying, well, there's lots of migrations around the world. We don't know. As though we can't we can't identify who the original people who settled Iceland were, right? Or like Madagascar, and we can't distinguish the Madagascar original settlers from across the Indian Ocean that have Southeast Asian ancestries, though we can't distinguish those genetic signals from the later sub-Saharan African inhabitants, right? This is just a generalized, like, we don't have, like, who knows? Maybe you're wrong. And like, okay, but you have to explain, if all of these historical events are wrong, you need to explain why that's the case specifically, and not just invoke generalized uncertainty, right? In the historical, in some cases written, historical record and the archaeological record. So I'm going to pick this back up at a little bit here. It's up to, 41. Here we go. May I?
go ahead.
I want to say this is, so he kind of went off on a little tangent here that wasn't related to the Canary Islands and the migrations and stuff, but he loops back and says, like, why does all this stuff, why can we explain this? So this is where I'm at. Because so it's, I use the Canary Islands as an example because it's well documented historical event, because the only settlement post the original settlement was Europeans in the 1500s, so we can easily tell those lineages apart. But I'll leave that to the side, because it's not just that one data point we can use. We can test this model against lots of similar instances within a comparable time frame. So you've got Iceland, you've got Madagascar, Vanuatu, several others. Now you could start, and you could, within a young Earth time frame. And then you could go beyond a young Earth time frame and say, okay, if Europe was actually settled 45-ish thousand years ago, here's what we expect to see. If Japan was actually settled, whatever 30-something, or maybe, I always get that, I forget which is which, but one of them was 30-something, one of them was 40-something thousand years ago. And if those numbers are true, we can say, okay, here's the level of divergence we expect to see. So again, we're making predictions, right? Here's the level of divergence we expect to see given the substitution rate model. And that's exactly what we end up finding. So it's not just one instance where we're relying on a historical record that you may disagree with. It's multiple instances where we're having historical records, archaeological data, and we're seeing that that's exactly in line with the genetic data. So that's my answer to, like, why does this model work? Like, it does. The creation model isn't really working. It's when we make these predictions, it lines up with the substitution rates that get you a mitochondrial most recent common ancestor in the neighborhood of 1 to 200,000 years ago, and a Y chromosome most recent common ancestor in the 2 to 300,000 year ago range. So I want to pick up right here. First of all, I agree with Dan last week. Dan. He got that right. And then I want to pick up with Dr. Jeanson here. There's a part that's not relevant, but I want to pick up with him right up here because he does address this concern. So here we go.
And we've seen it continue to work. So that's my main rejoinder. We can go into these specifics for these historical events and such. My main argument counter would still be there's this inherent assumption about the continuity of settlings and the dynamism of history.
Okay, so that's his answer. That there's migrations, there's dynamism, and we can't therefore say, who's to say what the correct kind of ancestral population is to use when we're doing these comparisons. The answer is that the historical and archaeological record, broadly speaking, is unreliable. That's Dr. Jeanson's response to not just the Canary Islands thing, but the concordance of all of these other data points as well that use the same methodology, right? Specifically in the post-flood time frame, the historical and archaeological record is unreliable. Okay, that's not an answer. That's an excuse, right? That's hand waving. You can't just say, we don't really know. You need to have a technical reason why that's wrong. Why can't we be sure who the original settlers of the Canary Islands are? Why can't we be sure who the original settlers of Iceland were? He used the example a few minutes ago of North America, where, we know that it was East Asian populations that crossed the land bridge into originally North America, but now the most common haplotypes we find in North America are European and American. Well, we can still tell who the original groups were. We can still do this analysis, right? And we have historical records that are way more recent than the settlement of North America from Asia that are way more reliable than those data. And Dr. Jeanson is saying those are not reliable. We can't tell who's who. That's not a serious argument to make. You need to engage seriously with the data that are being used here. And if you have specific technical objections to those data, then level them. But you can't just hand wave it all the way because, like, in general, humans migrate. We know how to deal with that. Okay. So that's how he destroyed me on that point for any young earthers watching. That's how that went. So now we're going to jump back in time. Okay, we're going to jump back in time to the most important part that came out of this, and then we're going to recap. So let me just get our time frame back a little bit here. We're going to pull it all the way back to right here, and this is going to be a very short little bit. Let's see, we want to start right there. Okay, and this is going to be a very short segment, but this was the most important moment of this conversation. This is where my career was ended. I was forced into early retirement by this unassailable rejoinder. Take a listen.
So let me again derive how I'm getting to this point. So we've got my claim from the examination of the published literature that the mutation rate is 3 mutations per generation, and I'm treating the mutation rate as a substitution rate. That this rate is consistent.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's what I'm doing now.
Okay. That was the big moment. That was it, right? I'm treating the mutation rate as a substitution rate, right? That was the big takeaway from this event. Now, at this point, I don't need the video anymore, so I'm going to take this down. We're going to take that out of the stream, and now it's just me for a few minutes talking here. So where are we here? Where are we at? So regarding that mutation rate point, this is a big deal because other young Earth creationists have had to deal with this. Dr. Jeanson is famously reluctant to comment directly when people criticize his work. So it's been left to other young Earth creationists to kind of make excuses for, on Dr. Jeanson's behalf when critics, myself and others, point out that he's playing this game at the mutation rate and the substitution rate. The admission that that's what I'm doing, that puts to rest like literally years of excuse making on Jeanson's behalf. I've commented on this elsewhere, so I'm not going to dive into the technical aspects of the problem here. Suffice it to say that many young Earth creationists recognize the problem with what Dr. Jeanson is doing and with what he just acknowledged, right? So other people realize that that is a problem and have been trying to explain why he's not actually doing that, right? So in terms of Dr. Jeanson's demolishing of an evolutionist, me. That's where we're going to leave it. But I want to recap before we end this. So this was a really, really useful and informative and for me, very positive conversation with Dr. Jeanson, because we touched on a bunch of the objections to his work that I've raised over the years. I got to ask him like a whole bunch of things that are on the list that I've wanted to talk about. So we talked about the 3-node mitochondrial DNA tree and how you can't get the 3 coexisting Noah's daughters-in-laws from that unrooted tree when you convert it. We talked about the supposed hypermutation aspect of Neanderthals as explaining their divergence. We talked at some length about the directly confirmed evolutionary predictions and the direct refutations of his mutation rate-based molecular clock. Those refutations based on known events that we can then take the actual data and compare the predictions based on each model. For each of these things, each of these critiques that I've leveled over the years that I was able to bring up to Dr. Jeanson directly, did he provide an adequate response? I mean, we all just watched his answers. The answer is no. He didn't provide. By the way, remember the original question was about Neanderthals? We never did get a direct answer to that. We did get a kind of an indirect answer to that. It's a little convoluted, but it's in there, and I'll talk about that another time at some point. But I will note that I've covered that already on this channel. We saw that he changed the topic. He said, well, that was a lot of stuff. Let's talk about something else. He criticized other people's work rather than address the critique that I was leveling. He invoked kind of just generalized uncertainty in the historical and anthropological record. No justification given for that. Just like, it's hard. Maybe we don't really know. And he invoked, let's say, not particularly persuasive arguments like some wonky things pre-flood to explain some of the seeming contradictions that that I was pointing out in his work. And here's the thing with all of that, for all those problems, and I think not particularly strong responses to the critiques, none of that matters as much as the simple admission that he's taking a per generation mutation rate and he's using it as a substitution rate for the purposes of his calculation. His entire body of work comes down to assuming you can extrapolate that single generation mutation rate back in time indefinitely, which is frankly an unserious argument. And if you read his work closely, like if you read Replacing Darwin closely, he knows that, because he'll talk about how you should have a different ratio of synonymous versus non-synonymous mutations depending on where you're looking. The reason for that would be selection, right? So he knows that it's not a strict linear molecular clock when push comes to shove, but he'll use a strict molecular clock to get the relevant numbers. All right, so you put all this together with, I should say, to get the desired numbers. Now you put all this together along with his complete misunderstanding of how phylogenetics works and how you can relate a phylogeny, right, to population growth. I recently had a conversation with Dr. Herman Mays that's linked down below. See that for the details on why that's wrong. But given all these problems, that conversation, what we just watched, I am left wondering, really? This is what they've got? Dr. Jeanson is supposed to be the guy, right? He's the guy who does the real YEC science, right? He's the guy, he's doing real science, he's making the predictions, he's taking it to the evolutionists, doing real science, and, building an alternative model that has robust empirical support. But if you poke and prod just a little bit, there's nothing there. The data contradict his model. It's bad arguments, excuses, right? So I will finish with this. I would love to talk to Dr. Jeanson some more. There's more that I want to talk about. We didn't even get a chance to talk about his created heterozygosity model, for example. That would be awesome. Now, Dr. Jeanson is, I think, famously reclusive when it comes to directly engaging with his critics. But I hope that his appearance on the Apologetics live show signals a change in that policy and that there might be more room for engagement down the road. Because again, I would love to continue this conversation on the topics we talked about and also on some other aspects of Dr. Jeanson's work that we didn't have time to talk about. And one more note before I end this, and we are ending this just momentarily here, but one last thing I want to point out here. One thing I learned from that conversation with Dr. Jeanson is that he watches my channel. He referenced my review of Traced, or at the very least, he watches the things I do that concern his work. So, hi, Dr. Jeanson. I hope we're able to talk again soon, and you can continue to destroy, dismantle, deconstruct, and demolish me live on YouTube at a later date. And that's why we'll end this, everybody. So thank you all for watching. I appreciate you all being here. I see there's a super chat on the side. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate your contributions. If you like what I'm doing here, hit the like button, share this, because I thought this was a really enlightening conversation, and it's really the first live conversation Dr. Jeanson has had with critics in a number of years. So I think this was a really useful event to kind of get cards on the table and see how he actually directly addresses some of the critiques with his work. Thank you all for watching. I hope you all have a great night. And I have some cool stuff coming up. I will announce that when I solidify the dates and times for it. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night. Bye.